Hi, guys, and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. I am joined by Amy Holland-Kemp, RD! Hey, guys, Dr. Daneza here. I'm going to be doing a webinar, 3 Keys to Ensuring SIBO Success, starting on February 15th, 2021. If you would like more information, I'm going to be posting on my Instagram page at Triangle Guts, Guts. And that is, I almost said .com. Oh my God, I'm so old. Instagram is at Triangle Guts, not .com. I am not that old. And I will be posting some information about that webinar and how you can register and check that out. But it's called 3 Keys to SIBO Success. And I think it's going to be really, really helpful. So if you'd like to check that out, I will be posting information on my Instagram profile this week. And we are going to talk about the thyroid today. So Amy, care to start us off?
I will. I think one of these days I'm going to have to do an intro for you and it'd be very intense just to kind of meet your energy level. But yeah, I think the thyroid is a really interesting topic just because a lot of the people that I work with and I know that you work with have some sort of thyroid related issue. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of connection between thyroid dysfunction and having certain low thyroid hormones. Wow, having trouble speaking today. And poor gut function from a motility standpoint, from a digestive capacity standpoint. You need thyroid hormones to digest your food well. And I know personally, I've struggled when I was going through my gut issues. I had really wonky thyroid stuff going on, and I didn't have the autoimmune component, so I was in that really weird, I had multiple antibodies run, which I know there can be some caveats, but I just don't think I was in the autoimmune category. But I was even by conventional standards low, which is kind of rare.
And remind me, was it your T3 that was low?
Yeah, my free T3 was low. It would be right on the border. I think the border in the past was 2.0. I see it varying a little bit. Sometimes it's 2.2 or something like that on some labs. Mine would be 2.0 or 1.9. So it'd kind of be right on the border, but it was low, and I definitely had a lot of thyroid symptoms. And I think the confusing part is it took me a little bit to clue in on the thyroid, just because when you're going through a SIBO scenario, so many people are fatigued and brain foggy that it can get really easy to just be oh, that's my SIBO acting up and not digging any deeper.
I think the converse is true too, though. I think a lot of people are oh, I'm fatigued, it must be my thyroid. It's but is it?
That's a great point too. That's a great point. I think it probably gets determined by what thing you were kicked off by first. So if it was the gut issues that maybe are more severe or something like that in your symptom makeup, or from a thyroid standpoint, if the fatigue energy issues, yes, you have some digestive issues, but it feels like those are the heavy symptoms. You can get pulled into maybe a thyroid group or a SIBO group, and then it just the research takes off and you can go down rabbit holes for each issue. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was just, I think there were a lot of nutrient related issues going on, especially when I was having testing done. It was sort of when I was under eating, probably eating too low carb, which is something I see a lot with my clients that aren't in the autoimmune situation. But if you look at their labs, they're not necessarily low enough to where you're oh, they need hormones or anything like that. That would be flagged by conventional standards, but it's low enough to where it's probably affecting their function, and they're having some symptoms. So again, for me, I that was sort of my profile, but I know a lot of people with thyroid issues have the autoimmune type component in there as well, and I know with your mom, that's how you sort of got into the functional medicine space. So I'm going to kick that over to you.
Yeah. And basically, my mom was that person who got put on Synthroid, was told, okay, you're good now. And then they continued to monitor her numbers for all of eternity. And there was no further dialogue about like the cause of why she was hypothyroid or the immune system, heaven forbid. And she would just go back to her doctor and be like, I'm not feeling quite right yet. Like, I'm still constipated. I'm still having trouble losing weight. I have no energy and like brain fogged. And they were like, you're fine. Your numbers are fine. Therefore you are fine. Or sometimes when she brought up the weight loss, my mom was really, really heavy when I was growing up. And she was literally told by doctors, oh, you're just looking for an easy way to lose some weight. Like, no, I'm not going to increase your thyroid hormone dose just so you can lose weight easier. Like, stop eating McDonald's, you fat fatty, or whatever, intonation they had. But like several doctors basically told her that. And yeah, so she just kind of like gave up. But it wasn't until I started going to school and learning functional medicine that I kind of put that together, and we tested her antibodies. And sure enough, she has Hashimoto's. So it's like, no wonder the poor woman didn't feel quite right when her autoimmune markers were there. Like, her immune system was going bonkers all that time. And she was inflamed. And yes, she had adequate thyroid hormone levels, but the rest of her body was kind of going to shit. So it's, with the autoimmune people, you've got to focus 90% of your effort, in my opinion, on the gut and the immune system. Yeah. And making sure they're nutrient replete so that they have like appropriate levels of vitamins and minerals and keeping their body well nourished. But oftentimes it's just this like really lame band-aid of like, here, take Synthroid forever, end of story, see you never. And, it's almost like the conventional medical world treats it as though thyroid stuff is super easy peasy, and it's actually oftentimes more complicated than they give it credit for.
Yeah. No, I think it's really frustrating listening to that story too, because I think the medical industry has like a pretty severe obesity bias too. So like I hate hearing that, like sort of like, oh, we're not really going to listen to you because of where your weight's at. Like, okay, how's that right? And then I think on the other end too, like some people that I was super skinny and having thyroid issues because I was losing weight, doctors were like, oh no, like this isn't the typical presentation of hypothyroid. And I'm sure like people with a lot of Hashimoto's people, don't really have any weight, like they're not carrying extra weight or anything like that. So that's the frustrating part, is I feel like there's kind of like sometimes this like observance of what you look like, and then like how they're going to provide care, which isn't always correct when it comes to thyroid issues. And I think it's typically viewed as like a metabolic disease, which it certainly is. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I think there's a heavy emphasis on how the person looks if it's a risk factor. I don't know if you kind of see that.
Yeah, I think, certainly with my mom's example, I don't know how many patients have told me that. I think probably before, but I don't remember how many.
Yeah.
But I would say from my perspective, and maybe it's like selection bias of the people I tend to work with for whatever reason, but I would say the majority of my Hashimoto's patients and my hypothyroid patients are normal body weight.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think the weight gain component of it is quite as common, at least from, maybe it's just selection bias of like who comes to see me, and I'm not seeing the whole cohort of Hashimoto's, but it seems like the weight gain is not as much of a surefire thing. Fatigue and brain fog is pretty much always there, but that's, if you think about like how many people who are inflamed have fatigue and brain fog. So I think it's just a product of the inflammation, maybe more than the thyroid hormone disruption. But yeah, I think that it's, yet again, and I feel like we're in the middle again, where like the conventional medical world is like, whatever, here, like easy peasy. And also, I think they underdiagnose. They underdiagnose Hashimoto's for sure, because a lot of doctors are just not even willing to write the order for the antibodies. Like, even if the patient goes to them and says, hey, I want to know if I have an autoimmune condition, can you please order this and this? Half the time doctors will say no, which just boggles my mind. But even if they do, run the diagnostics, then it's like, "Eh, okay, no big deal." And they have nothing else to kind of talk about. Or like I talked to somebody recently and she said her endocrinologist ran the thyroid antibodies, which was like miraculous for an endocrinologist to run that. And then they said, yeah, consider the paleo diet and just stay on Synthroid. And she was frustrated by that. But I actually was like, whoa, an endocrinologist told you to consider the paleo diet? That's crazy. That's like a really integrative endocrinologist. I mean, it's still really subpar quality of care, but coming from the conventional space, that was like, whoa, go you, man. Where'd you Google that? But, you know, it's like they're underdiagnosing the autoimmune component of it. And then they're oftentimes underdiagnosing or mismanaging the damn hormone component. Yeah. Like, I remember my husband was hypothyroid just for a little while, for like a year. Blip on the radar. I think it was due to stress, largely, when he was in grad school. And I happened to run blood work on him, like a big panel every year. And his TSH was like 5, I think. And the top end of that range usually goes up to like 4.5. So I was like, oh, okay. Well, this is enough that conventional medicine would actually care about it. Go. And I sent him to like the on-campus clinic or whatever at his school to get some medication. And the doctor told him with a straight face, okay, I guess we could prescribe you some levothyroxine, but usually we don't prescribe anything until it's at least twice the reference range. What? Yeah. What? So you wait for a person to be at like 9 for their TSH before you prescribe anything? Are you like, what the heck's the point of the reference range? And also, side note, the reference ranges kind of suck. So, like, I would love people to have attention paid, maybe not medication, but I would hope that their thyroid is being taken care of if their TSH gets above 3, let alone 4.5, which is the top end of LabCorp's range, let alone this doctor who's like, yeah, we usually don't care until it's twice the reference range. Like, why, what are you doing with your life? But luckily he, was basically like, my fiance is really insistent that I need this. And like, I already had the diagnostic workup. Like, she ran all the blood work. I just need the medicine. And he was like, oh, okay. And he eventually prescribed it. But that boggles my mind too, is like, the reference ranges stink to begin with, let alone when doctors are like, oh, you're only 5 or you're only 6. No, don't worry about it yet. Like, no, you're going to be pretty fatigued by the time you get there. Yeah. But let's rewind for a second, because I do think I can get excited about this, and probably you as well. Quick recap for those of you who are not super thyroid savvy. The markers that you see on blood work are usually going to be, if it's from a conventional doctor, they're usually going to test TSH, and that's it. TSH is not produced by the thyroid. It's produced by a part of your brain, and it's your brain telling your thyroid, hey man, make more juice. And then the thyroid is going to respond, hopefully by making more thyroid hormone. And then that can kind of regulate itself, right? So if your brain is having to scream down at your thyroid, like, oh my God, we need more hormone, that would be reflective of a high TSH. It's like your brain is yelling at your thyroid to do its job. And that's why we say that's low thyroid function, because it's like the brain has to work that much harder to get the thyroid to do its job. The converse, the flip side, if you have too much thyroid hormone, your brain is going to shut down that signal and say, nope, we're good. Nope, we don't need any more. And it will take away that stimulus, so then TSH goes low. So that's when you have too much thyroid hormone. So it's flip-flopped. It's a little counterintuitive. But then there's two thyroid hormones, T4, which is the vast majority of the thyroid hormone your gland produces, but it's not really active. And then T3, which is what we've referenced already, and that's the active form of thyroid hormone. That's the stuff that can go bind to your cells, do all the cool metabolism things, and all the cool things that we want thyroid hormone to do. Both are important, but like one is a little bit more of a storage form and one is the active form. So that's kind of your thyroid physiology primer that admittedly could have gone at the beginning of the episode.
True. And I think like thyroid too, just from a hormonal standpoint, it's viewed as like a metabolic type hormone.
Mm-hmm.
It controls the rate of like how we're using energy, those sorts of things. And again, it affects like the rate of digestion too, which is, again, why it can be so problematic, I think, when there's a SIBO situation or, again, from an IBS situation, because it can affect motility and digestion.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, too, like, I feel like, again, they're always feeding back and forth. So, again, with thyroid stuff, sometimes it is like chicken or egg situation, and they're always kind of feeding back and forth. And it's, I think you have to sort of do things that are supportive of both to reach homeostasis. And I think, again, with hormonal stuff, sometimes people, and even with gut stuff too, like we were talking about earlier, it's very easy to kind of go down one rabbit hole and be like, oh, I'm going to fix my gut to fix my thyroid, or I'm going to fix my thyroid and that'll help with my gut. But it almost has to be a very, very like dueling plan where you can address each piece.
Yeah, two-pronged approach.
Right, two-pronged.
Yeah, and I do think for the majority of people, I think thyroid dysfunction is caused by gut dysfunction.
Yeah.
For most people, probably. And maybe like toxicities or other stressors on the body.
Yeah.
But, and I've seen those patients where they come in and they're like, I just want to work on the gut, but their TSH, like their thyroid is jacked. Right. And it's like, sometimes people can have this like crunchy bias, which I totally get, but they have this mentality of, no, I refuse drugs are bad.
Yeah.
And if I just heal my gut, that'll heal my thyroid, because that's why my thyroid went bonkers in the first place. And I'm like, yes, and yet that doesn't necessarily pan out the way we want it to. And sometimes I have conversations with people where I'm like, look, I know you don't want to do a medicine. I know that it's medication, but can we have a conversation about this? Because I think it's important. And the analogy that I frequently use is that we're all into like root cause stuff, right? Like that's kind of the bee's knees in functional medicine and in the internet these days. But there's different types of root causes that can be really important to getting you better. You can have the root causes that set you up for dysfunction, but they don't necessarily like shove you into the gutter. So one example would be genetics, right? Like just because I have a celiac gene doesn't doom me to getting celiac disease. Because like 40% of white people have one of the celiac genes. So it's not uncommon. The analogy I've heard out of functional medicine sometimes that I hate, but I'll use it anyway, is that genetics loads the gun and lifestyle pulls the trigger. So it's like, just because you have these things, it's like you're getting nudged towards the edge of a metaphorical cliff, but you're not shoved off the cliff yet, right? And then there's the triggers, which are the root causes that we usually wrap our heads around, where, it shoves you off that cliff and now you have symptoms. So, maybe it was food poisoning, or maybe it was a bunch of antibiotics, or maybe it was a bunch of stress. Those are usually what people consider to be root causes, in the sense of like, oh, my gut problem started first and then my thyroid crapped out on me. Therefore, my root cause is the gut stuff. But our brains are not as good at tracking the stuff that led up to that final shove. And also the third type, which is the equivalent in this metaphor of having bricks in your backpack. So now you're hanging on by your fingernails on the edge of a cliff, and somebody strapped a backpack on your back and now put 10 bricks in your backpack. It's like, so, okay, maybe you being blatantly hypothyroid in this example and refusing medicine and having to deal with the inflammation of being a hypothyroid, like, no, the hypothyroidism didn't shove you off the cliff, but it's going to weigh you down a lot and cause a lot of dysfunction and inflammation to a point where it makes it damn near impossible for your body to heal if both things are not addressed simultaneously. So it's like you need to tackle as many of the things as you can to get your feet back on solid ground, and then you can worry about getting away from the metaphorical cliff edge. But like, the times where I've had this conversation with people and they're like, no, medicine is bad, or like, the thyroid is just secondary to something else. And I'm like, yeah, but it kind of takes on a life of its own by the time it gets going. And that's why we need to address it, even though it's not a trigger, but it's still a root cause for stuff that you're dealing with right now. Right.
Right. Like in that metaphor, it would be like if you're taking thyroid meds, that'd be like sort of pulling bricks out of the backpack.
Exactly. Yeah.
Making it easier to get off the cliff.
Yeah. Exactly.
I see that a lot too. Like it has kind of taken a life of its own and it needs some support in order for you to move forward. It might not be the root cause of your thyroid issue. But again, doing some things that are going to be supportive to get thyroid function back on track, because it's going to be really hard to get the gut back on track if the thyroid isn't supported, if it's that haywire. I totally agree with that. And one thing I too wanted to discuss, because I know we had discussed it at some point over Marco Polo and I think we discussed it even on here at some point about there was that study with T4 hormone and it being associated with like a higher prevalence or risk of SIBO. Is that accurate? Yeah. And you had some interesting thoughts on that, and I know we kind of went back and forth. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit about that study? Because it's basically made some people pretty nervous, and I've had a couple clients ask me about it. That they're nervous to take T4 because it's leading to more. It's like seen as being like a risk factor for SIBO. In talking with you, and again, like learning a little bit more about that study, there's a lot of confounding variables that make it, again, probably not the best conclusion to come to. Yeah.
Well, I think it's how you use the information, right?
Right.
So basically, my recollection from the study, I think it was like 2017 or maybe 18.
I remember the article being around that time. That's accurate.
So there was an article that came out that was looking at the risk factors for developing small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And I don't remember all of them now. Like there was some of the normal ones we would expect, like proton pump inhibitor use. And the strongest out of all the things that they looked at was the use of synthetic T4, so synthroid and levothyroxine. And some people within my profession, like I remember this one functional medicine guy, I remember him sharing it on his newsfeed or whatever, and basically saying, see, synthetic is bad and bioidentical is the way to go, or whatever it was. And I remember looking at that study and thinking, well, no, it makes sense, but for a different reason. So 90 or 95% of the time, people who are hypothyroid have Hashimoto's. They have an autoimmune inflammatory condition, and like hardly any of those people realize it. They're just told they're hypothyroid, end of story, take your drug and be gone with you.
Yeah.
So there's all these people marching around on planet Earth with an autoimmune inflammatory condition, many of whom are unaware. And if you think about it, like the way that thyroid hormone stuff will happen, like with Hashimoto's, like one day your immune system starts attacking your thyroid gland, and like 99.98% of the thyroid gland is fine, but like the 0.02% is inflamed. Well, that gland is still able to produce hormone at that stage of the game, right? So like on day one of the autoimmune attack, your hormone levels are not affected, but the inflammation and the autoimmunity has started. So that's like day one of the Hashimoto's. And then at some point, there's going to come a tipping point where like now the immune system has flamed out, I don't even know, like 70% of the gland. And you have 30% remaining or whatever it might be. I'm totally making numbers up with this. But there's going to be that tipping point where now you become so symptomatic that even the conventional medical doctors are going to say, gosh, golly, gee, we need to test your thyroid hormone. And then they're going to say, gosh, golly, gee, your TSH is 6.52. We need to put you on Synthroid. But if you think about it, that person, by the time they get to that stage, that person has had Hashimoto's for probably a few years. So they've been inflamed for probably a few years up until that point. And so we are seeing this medication almost as like a proxy to see a group of predominantly autoimmune inflamed individuals. And just knowing that inflammation doesn't do good things for your motility. And a lot of these people probably had dysbiosis to some degree to begin with, or candida or whatever, SIBO. Like, it kind of makes sense that that group of really inflamed autoimmune people are going to be at a higher risk of SIBO. It's like, they're inflamed, their motility sucks. So when I saw the study, I didn't think, oh, those medications are bad or evil, or that the medications cause SIBO. I just said, oh, well, yeah, the inflammation that they're struggling with, like if they didn't have SIBO before, they're going to get SIBO eventually because their motility is going to crap out on them from the inflammation. But it's not necessarily that the drugs caused SIBO. I think it's just that it's kind of coincidental.
Yeah.
And then similarly, so there was the group of people who were on synthetic T4, Synthroid or Levo. And then they said the next most prevalent group were people who had high TSH, but were not currently on thyroid medication. And it's like, okay, that also makes sense. Because theoretically, you know, the people who have had Hashimoto's for long enough and they've been inflamed for long enough that now they need medication, like they're kind of over here on the timeline. And then the people who are just now being diagnosed as hypothyroid, but they haven't had medication yet, like those people are kind of a few steps back on the timeline. So it's the equivalent of somebody who's freshly diagnosed versus my mom who's had Hashimoto's for like 34 years. So it's an earlier progression in the autoimmune inflammatory cascade. So yes, those people are at a higher risk of SIBO, but less so than the people who have probably had their autoimmunity ignored for decades by the time the study was done. So that's how I viewed it, at least. I think that it means that autoimmunity is a risk factor for SIBO, not necessarily that it was the drug that caused it. And as a side note, Hashimoto's is the most common autoimmune disease. I think it's like 8% of the population or 9. It's either 8% of women or 8% of the population has thyroid antibodies. So if you're going to judge autoimmunity and its relationship to SIBO, you're going to use Hashimoto's as a proxy for that because it's so much more common.
Right. I think it's almost, I think a good way to see it is that context matters. Like you can't just take the fact that people that are on a drug have a higher prevalence as meaning the drug's the issue. It's the context in the lens of what's actually going on underneath that. But I have definitely seen a couple people talking about Levo being problematic for SIBO. Yeah. And I know when we talked too, it's like, okay, so someone doesn't take a drug that's potentially going to support them, take some of the bricks out of their backpack. Yeah. And help with their gut repair and help with motility. Yeah, it makes them more stuck and kind of could prevent healing and moving forward from a gut standpoint. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, in terms of, I know we talked about a few. I wanted to just touch on some of the symptoms. Just to kind of run through. I would say I feel like most people that listen to our podcast are probably hip to like some thyroid, like they have some thyroid knowledge.
We hope, because it took us how long to get to the symptoms of hypothyroidism? Right. 28 minutes in? That's all right.
But I think that the symptoms side of things, so we talked a little bit about like sometimes weight gain, again, is like the popular thing that I think people think of with thyroid issues is like, oh, weight gain. But like you were saying, brain fog's a big one. Energy issues are a big one. Depression's a really big one. Yep. I think there was something like some study that was saying, 25% of people diagnosed with depression actually have like thyroid abnormalities, which is really interesting and sad that like people could be having underlying some of the depression could be some thyroid issues. Yeah. I think that I sort of remember when I was going through thyroid stuff, like it felt like it felt like you're like trying to walk in mud or like quicksand. Like it just felt like everything was very slow and like nothing moved quickly. I even think I had some like more slurred speech type issues. Like it's really weird. Like I'll watch old videos of myself during that time and be like, oh, my speech was slurred. And I even noticed it back then. But yeah, like I everything was just slower. I couldn't think straight. Those are the big ones. Feeling cold, hair loss are both huge.
Constipation also.
Constipation.
For hypo.
Right. From a gut symptom standpoint. Constipation's a huge one.
Yeah.
So those are the big ones that I see. Did I miss any besides the constipation? The one that we should probably talk about on a gut podcast?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you hit on pretty much all of them, the biggies at least. I mean, you can have like skin changes and edema and like there's other stuff that goes with it. Yeah.
Dryish skin.
Like scaly. So there's other stuff certainly that'll go with it. I think that tends to happen more in like really pronounced cases.
Yeah.
Like if you have a TSH of 5, I don't know if it's enough to really change your skin drastically. Get this, side note. Please guess the highest TSH I have ever seen.
I feel like I'm going to be way under. I don't know. Maybe 12?
Oh, you sweet summer child. No. I believe it was several years ago now, so I don't remember the exact number, but it was like 748.
Wait, what? Nuh-uh.
Yeah. No, I'm not even
Really?
joking. Yeah. Side note, that was a pediatric case. She was 12 or 13, and I ended up referring her to a pediatric endocrinology specialist at UNC because I saw that and I was like, whoa. Like I called the parents and were like, this is way out of my realm of what I can do. We've got to make sure that she doesn't have like some sort of disorder.
Right.
So yeah, I ended up referring her out.
I've never seen anything like that.
I didn't know it would go that high.
Right.
I didn't know they could measure it that accurately that high, but it was funny though. It was like 748.242 or something very exact. And that kind of made me chuckle. It's like after you pass
I know.
a certain number, you
like
don't
give or
need
take
the decimal
like
points.
100 at that point.
Yeah. It's like it's kind of all the same at that point. But yeah. And she did get on medicine and that greatly helped her. But that was the worst by far that I've ever seen. I think other than her, I don't think I've seen it above 20 or 25 typically, but that was like a holy shit moment.
Yeah.
But going back, so, that's enough that her skin and everything in her body wasn't going to work right.
Yeah.
But I think that the most common I see are like the fatigue and brain fog, depression and constipation probably are the biggest that we could directly attribute to the thyroid. I think, the presentation of like Hashimoto's versus iodine deficiency versus something else can be a little bit different, but I think generally those three are pretty consistent. As a side note too, I have seen firsthand an iodine deficient goiter. They still exist in this day and age. It's not common, but a patient of mine who had been working with me for a while up until that point, she switched over to just using sea salt, no iodized salt, and had been doing so for a while, and also has a pretty restricted diet because of IBS, and just apparently didn't get enough iodine in her diet. And she came to see me. This was a year or two ago, and she said, "Yeah, I think my thyroid's enlarged." And I had her swallow, and sure enough, it was a full-blown large goiter, and her TSH was like 12 or 13. But she had no antibodies, no nothing else. And I said, honestly, it looks like you might just be iodine deficient. Why don't we have you mix it up and do 50% iodized salt, 50% your hippy dippy sea salt? A couple weeks later, her TSH was back down at 2. The goiter was gone.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Easy fix.
Yeah, it's wild. I'm glad you brought that up too, because I find that really can be a factor if you're not getting, like most of Americans get iodine from iodized salt. There's not tons of other sources. It's
and
funny.
Then you do paleo or something, and
It's funny too, because with iodine, one of the sources is like dairy and cheese, and it's because
I'm doomed.
Well, it's because they put it on the udders. From what I hear, they'll put it on the udders to like prevent like bacteria and stuff from.
That makes sense.
It as like an antibacterial, so it's like not even really as much naturally in the dairy. It's that when the milk comes out, a little bit of iodine gets into the dairy, which is kind of like gross to me. It's like this udder iodine.
Yeah, udder iodine.
But yeah,
new T-shirt idea. Udder iodine.
Oh my gosh, that's
perfect.
Too funny.
That's wild. Yeah, I mean, I just dug in my drawer here. So unless you're like me and you are passionate for all things that are Asian, and you go to the Asian supermarket and get seaweed crisps to munch on, it's pretty much either this, salt, or bust. Like I don't think a lot of Americans get a ton of iodine in their diet normally. And if you're on a multivitamin that doesn't have a lot of iodine, or if you don't take a multi at all, you could become deficient.
Yeah.
So I've seen that at least once that we were able to confirm because she responded really well to the treatment and her labs all normalized and the goiter went away. So it can happen. Yeah.
And iodine, just for people to know, iodine, like when we say T3, it's because it has 3 iodine. T4 has 4 iodine. So you need iodine to make thyroid hormone.
Yeah.
So it's a really critical piece. I think it's interesting because I find that like the other nutrient that gets discussed a lot is selenium.
Yep.
But I think selenium's something that like most people get in their diet. Like I don't think that's necessarily a nutrient that I see being like super deficient in someone's diet. I don't know if you feel that way too.
Yeah, I don't think I see it as much. Sometimes if I see low T3, I'll experiment with having them take a bunch of selenium for a couple of weeks and just see if it responds. But it usually isn't quite that simple. And you're right. When I do look at people's diet, like food diaries, they're getting some, meat sources, or like some people are having 1 or 2 Brazil nuts a day. Just for the selenium. So I don't see it quite as commonly deficient either.
Yeah, I know like there tends to be a push, I think, of like anyone that is like low thyroid, like, just you have to take selenium across the board. I don't necessarily see that being the case. I think for people that are more plant-based, it might be a bigger, again, maybe doing Brazil nuts or something like that.
Yeah.
Might make some sense, but what about other nutrients? Or I'm thinking of things like iron. I think is an important one that's not really discussed a lot with thyroid hormones. It's important with thyroid hormone synthesis. So if like iron's low, you're gonna want to build that up to help with thyroid stuff. Things like zinc and vitamin A, I think, could be important too. And I think just in general, from a nutrition standpoint, you want to make sure that you're getting enough overall calories, enough carbs. That's probably the biggest one. I mean, I think that from a calorie standpoint, you can think about it as, okay, so the thyroid's controlling your metabolism. If you're not getting enough nutrition in, your body's going to try to slow down how you're burning that fuel. Yeah, like where it's trying to protect you. And I think that's what's like frustrating to people, because they're like, why is my thyroid hormone pooping out on me? But it could be, there could be a bit of it that's trying to protect you if it's from an undereating, like if that's kind of a major factor in your low thyroid hormones.
Well, it's kind of like your body saying, hey man, we don't have the fuel to go run a marathon, so don't get any funny ideas, right?
100%.
You sit on that couch.
Yeah, your body's like, okay, Amy's not getting the calories today, so we're gonna like really try to like utilize this fuel that she is taking in, because we know we're not gonna get enough to like really burn how we like to burn. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's really a really key piece, especially if I'm seeing like someone who's been restrictive and they kind of have, I would say, suboptimal levels, not necessarily out of range, but where I'm like, okay, your diet seems too restrictive and maybe you're under. I think carbs as well is a big one. Like if someone's been low carb for a while, that can be a huge factor. Carbs, the best way I can describe this is that carbs activate insulin more than any other macronutrient. So like more than fat or more than protein. And insulin kind of gets a bad rap. But insulin's an incredibly important hormone and can help with signaling to the body, hey, you have enough short-term fuel, is essentially the signal it sends. So thyroid conversion from the inactive T4 form to the active T3 form really likes that strong insulin signal. So when it gets that insulin signal, it can make that conversion more easily.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point.
Yeah, so a lot of times when carbs aren't quite where your body would like them to be, and you're not getting that insulin signal, you will have an underconversion of T4 to T3. So that's something, if someone's had like some hormone perturbations, that's something that I'll play around with, is like increasing carbs a bit. I think in general, hormones across the board tend to do better with not being super low carb. But
I think especially for women.
Yeah.
Because keep in mind, like, all the hormones talk to each other too. It's not just like insulin is in isolation floating around your body, or thyroid hormone is in isolation floating around your body. It's like, well, thyroid hormone kind of chit-chats with the female sex hormones, or testosterone if you're a man. And then both of those chit-chat with the adrenals and insulin. And it's this whole big tangled mishmash of a thing. And if you start messing with one of them, namely insulin, and dropping it really, really drastically, you are going to pull on the strings of the other hormones. It's just a matter of how and how much, and if it's going to be favorable for you. Yeah. No, I agree. I think that it's interesting because the functional medicine, there's like the functional medicine, like insulin kind of theory, that it's kind of the root cause of all disease, which Chris Masterjohn has a really, really good like podcast episode. He's solid. I like him. I haven't heard that one, but I do like his stuff.
Oh, I need to send it to you because it's so good. Basically, like, his point is that it's more of a the body's going to utilize fuel, like whatever macronutrients present. The real problem is over being over calorically, like chronically, more so than the insulin being a factor. Like, you could eat different combinations of macronutrients, but if you're kind of at your energy level or slightly under, you're not going to have problems with insulin issues. Is kind of his point. But yeah, it's I see that, like, again, I feel like that it's the sugar is the devil, that type of mentality. With the insulin theory on like chronic disease.
And that's a natural progression, like the swinging of the pendulum. We had the Fat is Evil campaign of the 80s and 90s, and now we're in this full swing of, no, all sugar and carbs are evil. Next thing you know, protein will be evil again. Like, did you know back in the day when Kellogg, I forget the first name of the guy, but Mr. Kellogg, when he like started the cereal company, it was specifically like he had a viewpoint that protein was evil, and it was like the worst thing ever. So he created breakfast cereal specifically so that you could have a breakfast devoid of protein, because he thought protein was like the worst thing ever. And we still have cereal. Right. But, give it time. The pendulum will swing, and it's going to be protein's turn again, which will be hilarious after the carnivore thing comes and goes. Yeah. Because right now protein is like the star child for everything. But not to digress, I think that you make some really solid points, and it's making me think of a patient right now that she's had low or like borderline low T3 for a while. And, we're trying to focus on her gut and SIBO and motility. And I finally got her to go to an endocrinologist to try to talk about this. And what's interesting too is I've had several patients where they've gone to an endocrinologist with actual low T3, like per LabCorp's crappy ranges. And the endocrinologist is like, oh, but we don't need to treat that. Like literally, if your TSH is good, you're good. And it's like, wait, but they make T3 medications, right? For a reason, you would think, maybe? Like, why don't you start that person on Cytomel or some T3 product instead of just saying, oh, your TSH? Like, and I forget what came of it with her, but maybe I'll have to talk to her about some of this too, or send her the podcast link. Because I think you made a really good point with the carbohydrates and insulin and signaling to your body that you have short-term fuel. I wonder too if probably inflammation might play a role also, because keep in mind, a lot of that conversion from T4 to T3 happens in the liver. Yeah. And most enzymes in the body, you can rev them up or turn them down with other signals, including inflammatory cytokines. Yeah. So I wonder sometimes if it's an inflammation thing too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. No, I think that's a really good point.
I know I've seen a teeny bit of research that NAC might help with low T3. Nice. That particular patient, it didn't seem to be tremendously helpful for her, maybe a little bit. But that's something too for anybody with low T3 that they could look into.
Yeah, I think that what I've seen with clients is that for a lot of that, I've definitely seen T3 increase when we're kind of honing in. If calories and carbs are low, I've definitely seen working on that help with their T3 levels from what I've seen. But there's certainly other factors, like what you were saying, all these hormones are communicating back and forth. So if there's stress and cortisol, and like that's going to shut things down too. And so there's a lot of different factors in that. But I think ruling out that your nutrition's adequate across the board with micronutrients and macronutrients is really key with thyroid issues. And I sometimes think that that's like an overlooked thing, or people are not necessarily, they're going keto or going, doing kind of more low carb. I think sometimes whole foods, not always, but like how it's presented in a more like Whole30 fashion can like naturally be a little bit lower in carbs. So just being cognizant of that, and maybe you in particular as an individual might need a little bit more carbs to help from a hormonal standpoint. There's going to be variabilities of what someone's like carb threshold is to support hormones. So again, it might take a little bit of experimenting, but I do think it's like worthy to make sure you're covering that base. Yeah,
I think that's relevant. And also, you know, we kind of almost picked on, without intentionally picking on them, like paleo, AIP, keto, carnivore, and all of the, and like Atkins, like all of the heavier meat, low carb diets. But I will say another point too is that you also need amino acids to build thyroid hormones. So also, if you're a vegan or a vegetarian or fruitarian or whatever other diets there are on that side of the world, you know, like the dietary world, that is, that could also be impeding thyroid function if you're not getting adequate protein, because like that's what hormones are. They are proteins. They're just big old chunks of protein floating around in your blood, and they happen to dock on a receptor on your cells and do cool things. But like you do need protein in order to make that hormone. And you're going to laugh at me, but is it tyrosine, I think, that you need specifically to make the thyroid hormone? Like that's the one that's talked about the most. Okay, good, because that would have been a nutritional embarrassment if I got the amino acid wrong. But you know, like you do need the building blocks for the hormones, and that also encompasses protein. So keep that in mind also.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, because I think even like more plant-based eaters, there's just so many potential like triggers or like things that can become deficient. And unless you're really cognizant, iron, even like vitamin Zinc. A, if you're not like a good converter to the active form, zinc, I mean, all these ones that are kind of crucial for thyroid hormone, even iodine, again, unless they're eating iodized salts, they probably could have the potential to be low.
I see a lot of sea salt with that crowd as well.
Yeah.
And I love sea salt, so it's not even like I'm anti. It's just that, like, I balance it. So, like, I have, for example, I have my little shaker of iodized salt here at my office. So when I eat lunch at my office, if I put salt on my food, it's iodized salt. But at home, we'll oftentimes use, sea salt. So it depends. Yeah. I try to get a little bit of both.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I like sea salt too. But I do mix it up a little bit. But yeah, I think that, again, there's a lot of potential for error if you're in one diet dogma or another when it comes to thyroid stuff. Because the thyroid really wants balanced nutrition for it to feel kind of safe for you to operate metabolically efficient, like in a metabolically efficient way. So, yeah.
Yep. Well, I will throw out another thing, too, to cover thyroid stuff. So when we think about thyroid autoimmunity, we think of Hashimoto's being the number one. For the hyperthyroid folks, it's going to be Graves', right? Mm-hmm. And that will produce completely different symptoms than what we've talked about today. But the treatment can be somewhat similar because ultimately you're trying to treat the gut and the inflammation and the immune system and the imbalances. But I think the numbers, I forget it. I think it's 90 or 95% of hypothyroid patients have Hashimoto's, and like 85 or 90% of hyperthyroid people have Graves'. So it's still a pretty good chunk of that population as well. But what I'll suggest, I don't know the stats for Graves', but there is such a thing as seronegative Hashimoto's, where, the person has Hashimoto's, that is the reason they are hypothyroid, and no matter how many times you draw their antibodies in blood, they will not show antibodies in blood. Yeah. I don't know, like, how that exactly parses out, but what I've seen is some cases where the person is hypothyroid and their antibodies are negative. Yeah. And then when that happens, I'm kind of like skeptical of that automatically. I'm like, I always assume Hashimoto's until proven otherwise. Yeah. So usually I'll tell that patient, here's how it looks right now, but it could be that we just didn't catch it that day. So in another X amount of weeks, I want you to go and we'll do another draw. And if I'm testing TSH again or T3 again, I'll just slap on the thyroid antibodies and I'll do it again. If it comes back negative a second time, oftentimes I'll go ahead and have them do one more. So like the next time we check something in blood work, I'll have them do one more. Yeah. And if it comes back negative 2 or 3 times in a row, and I'm really highly, highly, highly suspicious that it's Hashimoto's, like in a person who has multiple other autoimmune diseases. Right. And I'm like, I would be shocked if this wasn't Hashimoto's. The way that you could diagnose that is with a thyroid ultrasound. So I have had to refer people out for that, where it's like, okay, we really want to know if this thyroid thing is autoimmune. You look like you're a person who's not producing antibodies, but we're both pretty convinced it's autoimmune. So then I'll send them to like an imaging center to get a thyroid ultrasound. And then that's how it would typically be diagnosed at that point. But I think the numbers that I've seen say that about 10% of Hashimoto's patients are seronegative.
Yeah. Yeah, that's about what I've heard too.
Kind of a good chunk of people. So if you are a person who's like, oh, I've hypo, but I don't have antibodies, but I've had my iodine checked, or I've tried to have iodine and it doesn't touch it, what the heck is going on? That could be the case. You could be a seronegative Hashimoto's person. Yeah. In which case you want to get that evaluated so you know. The other thing to know too, and this, I don't have a concept of how common it is. I think it's not common. But you can have autoantibodies against T4 itself or T3 itself, which is wild and super frowned upon. Like, of all the things you could go after. But I've had just a couple of patients in a few years where I was like, I wonder if that's happening. Like, I forget the exact story now because it was several years ago. But this one patient, just really low levels of, I think it was T3. And like, no matter what we tried, it wasn't budging. And I think she might have even tried medication. And I remember wanting to send her out for it, but for whatever reason, LabCorp does not have that as a test. You have to do it through Quest. And for whatever reason, like, both times I thought to run the test, we've run into kerfuffles with like asking the primary care to order it through Quest, and then they run like the normal Hashimoto's antibodies and not the one that we're actually asking for. So I haven't seen the results come back in. I don't really have a sense for how common it is, but it must be common enough if Quest has orders for it that are able to be ordered. So that's the thing too. Like if you've tried a bunch of stuff for your T3, like I would definitely try the nutritional things and like be open-minded to more carbs and protein. Like I would try all those first. But if you've really genuinely tried everything and your TSA or your T3 or your T4 is not budging, and like you've tried even medications and that has limited usefulness, you could consider getting that lab done through Quest and seeing, okay, are you attacking your T3 directly? Because then supplementing with extra hormone just means that it's going to get attacked anyway. Like you really just have to clamp down on the autoimmunity at that point. Otherwise, your immune system's never going to stop attacking the damn hormone. So that becomes an even squirrelier situation. At least with Hashimoto's, you can do both at the same time. Like you can replace the hormone and you can do the autoimmune management. And then it's kind of like you get to do both at once. But when you have that direct autoimmunity to like T3, you could try to supplement them with T3, but it's just going to get attacked. So then the autoimmunity really needs to take super, super, super front seat for those people. Yeah. So that's a consideration.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think you're right. It's like from a thyroid standpoint, you want to make sure you're covering your bases, working on inflammation, working on nutrition, making sure like you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's. But if like something's not necessarily making sense, doing more digging and making sure you're working with someone that knows what they're doing. It's interesting too. Yeah. Here in Cincinnati, which I think is like a very cool specialty. One of a practitioner that I collaborate with sometimes is a functional endocrinologist. Nice. And she's fun. I believe she's Russian. And she's just like super cool. I mean, I think to have that specialty so unique. I know we've been talking about like endocrinologists can be hard to get to run labs, and she runs tons of labs. She saw me at one point for thyroid stuff. But by that time my thyroid levels were in a good place. Like I went to like say like, oh, I've had thyroid problems in the past, and we kind of ran a full hormonal panel and things like that, and they were looking good. But yeah, I know like that's just such an interesting specialty. I wish there were more like functional style endocrinologists, but she's the only one I've heard of. I don't know if
I feel like a lot of the functional people out there are kind of generalists. And then like I know even I'll be darned if I could find a good cardiologist here, or like a functionally open-minded cardiologist. And we have we have UNC and Duke, like we have good schools here, but the only person I know of in the country is in Phoenix, Arizona. It's that Dr. Wolfson guy. And I'm like, are there no other functionally trained, conventional trained, like MD, DO cardiologists? Like, come on. Right. But
I like her too, because she tends to be, her name's Dr. Nalia Goldenberg, shout out, but she tends to be pretty good about not being like too functional or too conventional. She kind of is right in the middle. She runs like her panels. That's nice. Her panels are intense, like in terms of like she tries to get everything through insurance. So like again, she's familiar with all the functional labs, but she'll like again put in tons of code so that like everything's kind of covered by insurance. But yeah, I really like her approach. It tends to be kind of in the middle where we sit. I think like every time we're referring to us being in the middle, we need to play that like song that's like stuck in the middle with you. You know that song? Yeah. I feel like that needs to be like I wish we had a button that like just kind of.
We'll have to do that in post. Right. At some point. That would be pretty funny.
Right.
Yeah, I do feel like that kind of every day of my life where it's like conventional medicine's way the heck over here. And then like one of our professions is over here, or the internet or people are over here. And I'm like, meet me halfway.
Yeah. I think with thyroid stuff too, just in general, like you were saying earlier, it can very easily go into a place where it's like, I don't want to use any medication. Like the very kind of almost like too functionally minded, too integrative, like too...
a little too crunchy. Maybe.
A little too crunchy versus like... and that's what's so hard. I feel like there's not a bridge in a middle ground at all in the thyroid space. And maybe that's just in general. Maybe we're just like loners maybe in the middle.
Well, I think honestly a lot of it's just a trauma response. If you think about it, like so many people have been burned by medicines.
Yeah, 100%.
Where they're like, my doctor told me to take Nexium, so I took it for 10 years and like I didn't know to question it and now I feel like crap. Or what, like so many examples, like, oh, my doctor told me to take antibiotics and I didn't think twice. And now, then it turns into this, like, I got hurt. Therefore, now I'm going to super question everything. Yeah. And I kind of get it. Like a lot of people get there for a reason because they've been frustrated or hurt by not questioning medication. But then, I think that there are certain medications that I would be open-minded to. Like when I work with my mast cell patients, if we can get them on cromulin sodium, awesome. Yeah. Like, it's a prescription, but it'll stabilize the mast cells and make your life a whole heck of a lot easier. Or like if you're type 1 diabetic, please God, use insulin. And I see Hashimoto's kind of along the same way. Like if, you don't want to be the type 1 diabetic who's like, I'm just going to treat it naturally. Like, no, you'll die. Like you don't produce this hormone, you need to replace the hormone. Or like you wouldn't see an Addison's patient refusing to take steroids for their Addisons because steroids are bad. Like they would just be like, oh, like I feel like I'm going to die without them, so I'm just going to take it and be done with it. Like thyroid hormone, oddly enough, I think that you do kind of have the luxury in a weird way of like, you can get by being hypothyroid. It's not going to kill you or put you into like a weird coma or something immediately. It'll just make you really miserable and like depressed and yucky and inflamed for the rest of your life. But like you could probably be pretty hypothyroid before you get to that like life-threatening stage. Yeah. Versus some other autoimmune diseases, you don't have that luxury with it. But I see it as kind of analogous. Like, if you don't make the hormone, just take the hormone and be grateful that it exists with the caveat, like, keep your wits about you. And if we can treat the root cause and get you off of the medication later on, that's great. Yeah. Like, that would be wonderful. But, don't deny your body something it needs in the moment just because it's not natural.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, too, because I have talked with clients who are considering going on meds or not, and their first question is like, will I be able to get off of it? And I think sometimes that's a hard question to answer depending on like how progressed their Hashimoto's is. So it becomes like I think something to really sort of discuss. In certain situations, yes, you could probably come off of it, but in others it's probably unlikely. So I think that's good to kind of mention.
Yeah. I always tell people, because I get that question a lot, and I always say, maybe. Yeah. I hope. Yeah. But like, I wouldn't cling to that too tightly, but that's going to be a goal. Yeah. But I've seen it happen before. Like I still remember like one of my first patients, when I got into practice, like she had PCOS, Hashimoto's, her cholesterol, her total cholesterol was like 310. This was like a 24-year-old fit young woman, eating healthy. And like we primarily worked on her gut and her hormones. And then like her PCOS pretty much regulated itself. She's pregnant now, actually. And her cholesterol went right back into the normal range. And she was able to get off of thyroid hormone medication, but she was on it for a short period of time because her TSH, I forget, it was like 5. And so we sent her to an endocrinologist, got her on some meds. That helped her for a period of time. And then just eventually we monitored and were able to get her off of it. But if you had a patient like my mom, I think I went to that Karazian class, called my mom and told her we're going gluten-free, Mom. I think I was like 24 or so-ish. So by that point, my mom had already had Hashimoto's for like 24 years. Yeah. And that's a person where it's like, all right, we're going to go gluten-free and work on your gut and work on your autoimmunity because like, I don't want you to get sicker and more inflamed. But this is not a conversation of you can go off your levothyroxine. Like that thyroid's toast, man. Don't even sweat it anymore. Yeah. We're just going to make sure that you don't progress into other squirrely ass autoimmune stuff at this point. But if it's, if you've had Hashimoto's for like a year or 2 or 3 or 4, and it's a fresh diagnosis and your dose of your medication hasn't been too high up until this point, then there's some hope that you could alleviate the inflammation and then get off the medicine. I think that's reasonable for a lot of people. Yeah,
for sure. And I think with Datis, he has that thyroid book, which can be like a good starter for anyone that's like newly into the thyroid weeds. Just to kind of give you a sense of like what these markers mean, what could be kind of potential root causes. I know for me, like my TSH was more on the lower side, but my hormones were also low. So like there was a total disconnect between my thyroid or my what am I talking about? A total disconnect between like my brain and my actual hormones. Like my brain should have been screaming like make more, and my TSH should have been rising, but it wasn't. So I think a lot of times in situations like that, it can be stress related, kind of pulling that down. So if your TSH tends to be a little bit on the lower side, I would, and hormones are then lower, that's kind of an interesting thing too. Typically it could be kind of stress response related. I
think that's a big one. What's funny is, I know like in Datis's classes, like his big 3-day or 4-day thyroid seminars, like there's a whole section in the notes where it'll be like the 23 thyroid hormone patterns. And like, he goes through like, if this is high, this is low, this is normal, then think this. And there's like a degree of pattern recognition. We've covered some of the basics of like, low TSH versus high TSH, low T3, high T3. But like there's a gajillion different patterns that you can parse out. But that being one of them, it's that brain gland communication not working super hot, usually is from stress. And funny enough, 2 of the herbs that can help with that are both adaptogens, ashwagandha and maca. They're both fantastic. Actually, I think maca was one of the things that I had that patient on with the cholesterol, PCOS, Hashimoto's, all that stuff. And it really, really helped her. But like, it's not coincidental that some of the herbs that are known to help with that brain gland communication happen to be adaptogens. I think that's kind of fitting and not coincidental.
Yeah, for sure. No, I 100% agree. So where are we at? Have we covered?
Yeah, let's think. The downside to us just conversing and not having a script. It's okay. You get what you get on this podcast, okay?
We don't plan. We are not planners.
We're not. We let the conversation juice flow between us in a beautiful, beautiful thing. So we talked about symptoms. We talked a little bit about the labs and the diagnostics. We talked about nutrition as it pertains to thyroid. Do you have any 2 cents on dietary fat as it pertains to the thyroid? We did talk carbs and protein and some vitamins and minerals. Fat isn't always front of my mind when I think about thyroid function, other than just like inflammatory balance in the body, like omega-6-3 ratios and trans fats and just a general inflammatory pattern. But can you think of a reason why we would want to focus on fat specifically?
I think, again, from a hormonal standpoint, usually having adequate fat and certain fats are good for hormone production. So I do think, again, making sure you're getting kind of a wide variety of different fatty acids can be helpful for most hormones. I think thyroid included.
Yeah, I would say that too. And if you think too, like the way that hormones work is that you've got this bubble of fat called the cell. And it's got like little chunks of protein. Those are the receptors. And then this other chunk of protein that's floating by in the bloodstream, aka the hormone, attaches itself. So the two proteins kind of join together, the hormone and the receptor, and then it communicates with the rest of the cell to do different stuff. Make new proteins, read new DNA, do something different. And one of the things that's between them is that lipid bilayer of the cell and the lipids inside the cell and the organelles. So yeah, it stands to reason that you would need some degree of fat for all hormones to function, kind of broadly speaking.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't think of anything like ultra specific to the thyroid beyond just like fat balance and inflammatory balance.
I would agree.
I think I'll maybe close us out with this, is that not only do you need thyroid hormone for motility sake, but also it can help heal leaky gut.
Yeah.
So likewise, if you're a person who has leaky gut syndrome and maybe you've been in that place of like not wanting to take a thyroid hormone medication and kind of being resistant to that, but you are finding that you can't heal your leaky gut, that could be a ticket to healing the leaky gut. And it might just be that you need to support your thyroid hormone for a while and then have the goal of getting off of the medication possibly down the road. But that's something that I know I've read too, is that you need thyroid hormone and you need other hormones too, like estrogen and progesterone if you're a woman, testosterone if you're a dude. Like you need a lot of these hormones to help regulate the permeability of the gut. And they probably have some crosstalk with the microbiome too. And I'm a little bit less familiar with that. But more food for thought, why thyroid hormone is super important.
Yeah, I love that. I love that point. And I think, again, like, we'll have to do some stuff on, like, sex hormones, too, at some point, and, like, the estrobolome.
Oh, yeah.
Those sorts of things would be cool.
Yep. All due time, my dear. We have lots more podcasting to do together.
We do.
So, well, guys, I think that's a wrap. I think we covered most of the things, at least as it pertains to hypothyroidism. I feel like we need to do a different episode on hyper down the road. And then the Graves people won't feel neglected and sorry that we left them out of the conversation here.
Yeah.
But guys, as always, if you are listening to this on a podcast app such as Apple or iTunes or whatever it's actually formally called, if you could rate us 5 stars and share this with all your friends, that would be great. And if you're on YouTube, then hello, YouTubers. Will you please click the like, the bell, the subscribe, leave a comment down below, do whatever you do in YouTube. We have an Instagram handle, and it is
ibs.freedom.podcast.
Yes, and we have a Gmail, ibsfreedompod@gmail.com. So you can get a hold of us, you can internet stalk us, you can share with all your friends, and we will see you in the next episode.